Hi, in this tutorial, we're going to go over the greatest common factor and factoring by grouping. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to find the greatest common factor, how to factor out the greatest common factor of a polynomial, how to factor out the negative of the greatest common factor of a polynomial, and how to factor by grouping. So factoring a polynomial means finding an equivalent expression that is a product. So here we have 10x squared plus 15x, and to factor that means to get an equivalent expression that is a product. So here we have 5x times 2x plus 3. Now the greatest common factor is an expression that divides every term of the polynomial. So here's an example of factoring the greatest common factor. Here, in our greatest common factor, we can factor out the term 5 from 10 and from 15. We could also factor out an x from x squared and x. Notice that the variable part of the greatest common factor always contains the smallest power of a variable that appears in all terms of the polynomial. So here in 5x, notice how we get the variable 1 from x raised to the 1 power and not x squared. So factoring, when you factor, you always get the variable raised to the smaller exponent. So let's do an example. Let's find the greatest common factor of 16x squared y, 20x cubed y squared, and 8x squared y cubed. So if we look at 16, 20, and 8, we can notice that these are factors of 4. So that means we can factor out a 4 from 8, a 4 from 20, and a 4 from 16. Now if we look at x squared, y cubed, and x squared, well, we always get the variable raised to the smallest exponent. So here we have x squared is our smallest exponent. So that means the greatest common factor that they have is x squared. Now if we look at y squared, and y cubed, again, we always get the smallest variable raised to the smallest exponent. So here we have y to the first power. So y is the greatest common factor in y squared, and y cubed. And that means that our greatest common factor of all of these numbers are 4, x squared, y. Now here's how to factor a monomial from a polynomial. First, you're going to determine the greatest common factor of all terms in the polynomial. You're going to express each term as the product of the greatest common factor and its other factor. And then you're going to use the distributive property to factor out the greatest common factor. So let's do an example. Let's factor 16x squared plus 20x cubed y squared plus 8x squared y cubed. So here we're going to write it. Our greatest common factor, which is 4x squared times 4 to give us 16x squared. Here we have 4x squared times 5y squared plus 4x squared times 2y cubed. Now we can factor out 4x squared times 4 plus 5y squared plus 2y cubed. So that's our answer. Now here's how to factor a monomial from a polynomial with a negative coefficient in the first term. So the first thing you're going to do is express each term as the product of the negative of the greatest common factor and its other factor. Then you're going to use the distributive property to factor out the negative of the greatest common factor. So let's do an example. Let's factor negative 20x cubed y squared plus 10x squared y squared minus 15x cubed y. So let's determine their greatest common factor. So 20, 10, and 15, our greatest common factor is 5. Now because we have negatives, we're going to use a negative 5. Now we have x cubed, y squared, and x cubed. So that means our greatest common factor is x cubed. And then we have y squared, and y. So that means our greatest common factor is y. So now we're going to take our greatest common factor, negative 5x squared y, times 4 to get 20. Then we're going to multiply x to get x cubed. And then we're going to multiply y to get y squared. Now we're going to add our greatest common factor again, and then multiply that by 2 to get 10, negative 2, and then we're going to multiply that by y to get y squared. Now we're going to add our greatest common factor, and then multiply that by 3 to get 15, and x to get x cubed. Now we can factor out our negative 5xy's x squared y times 4x y plus negative 5x negative 2y plus 3x. So that's our answer. Now here's how to factor by grouping. You're going to group terms that have a common monomial factor. There will usually be 2 groups. Sometimes the terms must be rearranged. And then you're going to factor out the common monomial factor from each group. And then you're going to factor out the remaining common binomial factor if one exists. So let's do an example. Let's factor xy plus 5x minus 3y minus 15. So here we can factor out an x from xy plus 5. So here, using this, we can factor out an x so that we get x times y plus 5. Now in here, we can factor out a negative 3 from negative 3 and negative 15, so that we get y minus 5. Now we can combine we can also turn this -3 into a +3 and y plus 5 into a y positive 5. Yeah, we can have this as a -3. So now we can rewrite this as x, y plus 5 minus 3 times y plus 5. So now we can factor out our y plus 5s, and then we have x minus 3. So that's our answer. So in this tutorial, you learned how to find the greatest common factor, how to factor out the greatest common factor of a polynomial, how to factor out the negative of the greatest common factor of a polynomial, and how to factor by grouping. Now try and solve problems in the greatest common factor and factoring by grouping workbook. For more help, sign up for online tutoring. And then in the next tutorial, we're going to go over factoring trinomials whose leading coefficient is 1. Thank you.